The fight for gay rights has been a long and painful struggle. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT people have always been forced to hide their sexuality. Momentum in the gay rights movement didn't fully pick up until the mid-20th century after the Stonewall Riots, when the first organizations were formed and activism ramped up. Unlike race, gender, age, ethnicity, or religion, sexual orientation is not protected under the federal civil rights law. People were discriminated in both public and private life based on their sexual orientation. In 1948, Alfred Kinsley published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, sharing his research on homosexual behavior. Kinsley concluded that homosexual behavior is not limited to people who identify as homosexual, surprising many conservative notions about sexuality, and especially surprising psychologists and psychiatrists in the 1940s who considered homosexuality a form of illness. In fact, in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association listed homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. Being gay at this time was considered a mental disorder, a disease. People believed that there was a cure to homosexuality and, more importantly, that it needed to be cured.
There may be some in this auditorium. There may be some here today that will be homosexual in the future. There are a lot of kids here. There may be some girls that'll turn lesbian. We don't know. But it's serious. Don't kid yourselves about it. They can be anywhere. They can be judges, lawyers. We ought to know we've arrested all of them. So if any one of you have let yourself become involved with an adult homosexual or with another boy, and you're doing this on a regular basis, you better stop quick. Because 1 out of 3 of you will turn queer. And if we catch you involved with a homosexual, your parents are going to know about it first. And you will be caught. Don't think you won't be caught. Because this is one thing you cannot get away with. This is one thing that if you don't get caught by us, you'll be caught by yourself. And the rest of your life will be a living hell.
The Mattachine Society was formed in 1950 by Harry Hay in Los Angeles. It was one of the first homophile organizations in the United States, after the Society for Human Rights. In the 1950s, gay people still wished to be private about their sexuality, rather than politically and socially active. At this time, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy was protesting communist influence and disloyalty in the U.S. government and soil. The era of McCarthyism was filled with investigative action against security risks to U.S. government, which included sex perverts. The Mattachine Society rose during this time to battle the stringent measures of McCarthy and others to remove homosexuals from the government. These first gay rights organizations protested government policies and cultural injustice. The main anti-gay sentiments were ignited by the government. Men and women were deprived of jobs, security, peace, and respect. Beyond that, government policies drove many to suicide and cemented homophobic attitudes that would consume American society for years. Homosexual acts were illegal in citizens' private and public life and could be punishable for up to life in prison, confinement in a mental institution, or even castration. Every state adopted some form of sodomy law as it joined the United States, whether it was written into law formally or as an unwritten common law. All states had laws against sodomy by 1960. On April 27, 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10450, which banned gay men and lesbians from working for any agency of the federal government. Eisenhower believed homosexuals were a threat to national security and that they would be blackmailed into sharing government information with foreign agents for fear of exposure. Secretary of State James E. Webb noted in a report, "It is generally believed that those who engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons." During the Red Scare, McCarthy and others searched for communists within U.S. soil. The search for homosexuals, however, known as the Lavender Scare, was the primary agenda. Thousands of people lost their jobs and security simply because of their sexual orientation. Eisenhower engraved the notion among gays that they were worse than communists, that they had somehow betrayed their country. The first lesbian rights organization in the U.S., the Daughters of Bilitis, DOB, was founded in 1955. The DOB also published a monthly magazine by and for lesbians, The Ladder. In a climate of fear and hostility, the Daughters united in the struggle for peace and freedom. Daughters of Bilitis meetings were very secret for fear of exposure. The small secret San Francisco organization helped launch an international lesbian movement and create a lesbian identity in the predominantly male homophile movement. As people began to unite and fight for a common cause, progress in the gay rights movement started to become visible. On January 1, 1962, Illinois repealed its sodomy law, becoming the first U.S. state to decriminalize homosexuality. Before the Stonewall Riots, gay culture was very conservative. American society was unaccepting of gay people and in many cases hostile. Leading up to Stonewall, gay culture became more prominent as the LGBT community began to fight for their rights. Organizations demanding respect and equal rights for people regardless of gender, identity, or sexual orientation emerged in the United States in the 1950s. Early groups used the term homophile, which means loving the same, to describe themselves. The gay rights movement grew with the rise of the civil rights movement and the counterculture of the 1960s. As blacks and women in America fought for basic rights, gays were inspired to initiate change for themselves. Moving from a conservative position on social change, many gay activists turned to a more radical and militant stance in the 1960s. This new stance would greatly surge after the Stonewall Riots. Some gay activists formed groups called the Pink Panthers, named to resemble the Black Panthers, a radical black activist group. The African American civil rights movement triggered many of the great movements for social justice and equality in the United States. The movement pioneered a powerful political concept of minority rights and made it easier for gays to depict themselves as a minority who deserved the same civil rights that other Americans and minorities enjoyed. The March on Washington in 1963, led by MLK, was followed just 2 years later by the first gay civil rights pickets outside the White House and a protest at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. On April 17, 1965, Frank Kameny and Jack Nichols, co-founders of the Mattachine Society of Washington, launched the first gay and lesbian protest in front of the White House, along with members of the Daughters of Bilitis. The protest was not welcomed by the mainstream gay movement of the time. More conservative leaders felt picketing would draw adverse publicity and greater hostility. Nevertheless, Nichols recalled, "We'd stood up against the power structure, putting our bodies on the line. Nothing had happened except that we'd been galvanized and to a certain extent immunized against fear. Never before had gay people as an organized group paraded openly for our rights." The Mattachine Society of Washington's protest of the White House is one of the most significant events in LGBT history. Shortly after the pickets in front of the White House, gays protested again outside Independence Hall in Philadelphia on July 4th. The homophile organizations who organized the picket called it an annual reminder to remind the public that a large group of citizens is denied the rights and equality promised by the Declaration of Independence, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The annual reminder day continued until 1969, when the day was changed to June 28th in 1970 to commemorate the anniversary of the Stonewall Riots. A flyer for the 1965 annual reminder day stated, "The homosexual finds himself denied the equality of opportunity which is so essential a part of our American way of life, simply and only because he is a homosexual." A year after the first reminder day, members of the Mattachine Society held a sip-in at Julius's Bar in Greenwich Village, New York, similar to the sit-ins SNCC students did during the Civil Rights Movement. The New York Liquor Authority prohibited serving LGBT people, calling them disorderly. Julius's was a historically gay bar, but since it had recently been raided, the bar was under strict observation. Members of the Mattachine Society knew this and decided to challenge the unfair regulation by admitting to their sexuality and asking to be served. The activists were refused service, and in turn, the Mattachine Society sued the New York Liquor Authority. No laws were overturned, but the NYC Commission to Human Rights declared that homosexuals have the right to be served. Very few establishments welcomed openly gay people in the 1950s and 1960s. Those that did were often bars, although bar owners and managers were rarely gay. The Stonewall Inn was and still is located in Greenwich Village in New York City. Greenwich Village was home to a large homosexual population after World War I, as men and women who served in the military settled in larger cities. The LGBT community developed a distinct subculture over the next 2 decades. The social repression of the 1950s resulted in a cultural revolution in Greenwich Village. At the time, the Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia, who paid off police to prevent raids. It catered to a variety of people and was known to be popular among the poorest and most marginalized people in the LGBT community: drag queens, transgenders, male prostitutes, and homeless youth. By the early 1960s, a campaign to rid New York City of gay bars was in full effect. The government revoked the liquor licenses of the bars, and undercover police officers worked to entrap as many homosexual men as possible. In time, the Mattachine Society succeeded in ending the campaign of police entrapment in New York City. However, they had a more difficult time with the New York State Liquor Authority, SLA. While no laws prohibited serving homosexuals, courts allowed the SLA discretion in approving and revoking liquor licenses for businesses that might become disorderly. Very few places existed other than bars where gays were able to congregate openly without being harassed or arrested. Many events led to the riots at Stonewall, which occurred just after midnight on June 28, 1969. One of the most immediate causes was the death of actress Judy Garland only days before. On June 22, 1969, Garland died from an accidental drug overdose in London. Her funeral was held on Friday, June 27th, in New York City. Her struggles with drugs and personal relationships during her glory days mirrored similar struggles among urban closeted gays during the same era. The LGBT community identified with Garland because she had fought through and survived similar problems. The LGBT community also used the term Friend of Dorothy, a code name deriving from Garland's portrayal of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, to identify with each other. The rainbow flag, a symbol of the LGBT community, may have also been inspired by Garland's signature song Over the Rainbow. 22,000 people attended Garland's funeral on June 27th, many of them gay. At 1:20 a.m. on Saturday, June 28, 1969, shortly after Garland's funeral, police arrived at the Stonewall Inn, starting the raid. About 205 people were in the bar that night. Those who had never experienced a police raid were confused. A few who realized what was happening began to run for the doors and windows in the bathrooms, but police barred the doors. The raid did not go as planned. Standard procedure was to line everyone up, check their identification, and have female police officers take customers dressed as women to the bathroom to verify their sex, upon which any men dressed as women would be arrested. Those dressed as women that night refused to go with the officers. Men in line refused to produce their identification too. Those who were not arrested were released, but they did not leave as quickly as usual. Instead, they stayed outside and a crowd began to grow and watch. Within minutes, 100 to 150 people had congregated outside, some who had just been released from Stonewall, and others after noticing the police cars and the crowd. Police escorted mafia members and bar employees into patrol wagons. The crowd, most of whom were gay, had grown to at least 10 times the number of people who were arrested. Some people shouted gay power, while others started singing We Shall Overcome. Beer cans and other things were thrown at the police as the rumor spread through the crowd that people inside the bar were being beaten. The police tried to restrain some of the crowd, which infuriated bystanders even more. More people were attracted to the scene as the commotion grew. Someone in the crowd declared that the bar had been raided because they didn't pay the cops off, to which someone else yelled, "Let's pay them off." Coins flew through the air at police officers, which represented the payoffs gay bars had to make to the police to stay in business. The police, now outnumbered by between 500 and 600 people, grabbed several people and barricaded themselves in Stonewall. Michael Fader, a participant in the riot, explained, "We all had a collective feeling like we'd had enough of this. Everyone in the crowd felt that they were never going to go back. It was like the last straw. It was time to reclaim something that had always been taken from us. It was the police who were doing most of the destruction. We were really trying to get back in and break free, and we felt that we had freedom at last. We weren't going to walkly meekly in the night and letting them shove us around. It's like standing your ground for the first time in a really strong way, and that's what caught the police by surprise. There was something in the air, freedom a long time overdue, and we're going to fight for it. It took different forms, but the bottom line was we weren't going to go away, and we didn't." The crowd tried to get in by breaking the windows with rocks, garbage, and fire. When demonstrators broke through the windows, the police inside unholstered their pistols. The doors flew open and police officers pointed their weapons at the angry crowd. The Tactical Police Force, TPF, of the New York City Police Department arrived to free the police trapped inside Stonewall. The police were humiliated and furious they had lost a fight to fairies, who weren't even supposed to riot. The TPF tried to clear the streets by marching slowly and pushing the crowd back. The mob openly mocked the police and formed kick lines. Police then rushed the crowd and hit them with bats. Police chased participants through the crooked streets in the surrounding area of the Stonewall Inn. Members of the mob stopped cars, overturning one of them to block Christopher Street. Massive crowds of angry protesters started to chase the police for blocks, screaming, "Catch them!" All day Saturday, June 28th, people came to stare at the burned and blackened Stonewall Inn. Graffiti appeared on the walls of the bar declaring, "They invaded our rights and legalized gay bars." That night, rioting began again. Many of the same people returned, along with thousands of others who gathered in front of the Stonewall Inn, which had reopened. The crowd filled the entire street, along with the surrounding blocks. Hundreds of police officers were present. Street battling went on again until 4 a.m. on Sunday, June 29th. Riots in Greenwich Village were sporadic on Monday and Tuesday. On Wednesday, a mob descended upon Christopher Street. Another explosive battle took place, with injuries to both demonstrators and police. The incidents on Wednesday night lasted about an hour and were summarized by one witness. "The word is out. Christopher Street shall be liberated. The fags have had it with oppression." A feeling of urgency spread throughout Greenwich Village, even to people who had not witnessed the riots. Many who were moved by the rebellion attended organizational meetings, sensing an opportunity to take action. On July 4, 1969, the Mattachine Society performed its annual picketing in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the annual Reminder Day. Participant Lily Vinces remembered, "It was clear that things were changing. People who had felt oppressed now felt empowered." Shortly after the Stonewall Riots, many gay organizations were founded, including the Gay Liberation Front, GLF. The GLF was formed in New York City but only lasted for 2 years due to its lack of structure. However, the GLF inspired LGBT people around the world throughout their publications, actions, and motivation. The first Gay Pride Parade in U.S. history commemorated the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Riots in New York in 1970. Hundreds of organizations were founded after the Stonewall Riots. Frank Kameny, who founded the gay rights movement in Washington in 1961, estimates that 1,000 organizations formed within a year after Stonewall. After 2 years, 2,500. After 3 years, he stopped counting. The Stonewall Riots started the gay rights movement in America as well as a worldwide movement. Stonewall has been referred to as the hairpin dropped heard around the world. The number of gay rights organizations skyrocketed in the U.S. and around the world following Stonewall. As the number of organizations grew and voiced their rights, the LGBT community finally won their sanity. In 1973, homosexuality was finally removed from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental illness. Being gay was no longer a disease. After Stonewall, the LGBT community won political successes for the first time as well. In 1974, the first openly gay American was elected to public office. Kathy Kucherzenko won a seat on the Ann Arbor, Michigan City Council. A few years later, in 1977, Harvey Milk won a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Milk's election gave never-before-experienced hope to LGBT people everywhere at the time when the community was experiencing widespread hostility and discrimination. Milk spoke out on state and national issues concerning LGBT people, including his campaign against California Initiative Proposition 6, outlawing homosexual teachers. The LGBT community was finally receiving recognition and more respect from the U.S. government.
2 days after I was elected, I got a phone call, and the voice was quite young. It was from Altoona, Pennsylvania, and the person said, "Thanks. And you've got to elect gay people so that that young child and the thousands upon thousands like that child know that there's hope for a better world. There's hope for a better tomorrow. Without hope, not only gays, but those blacks, and the Asians, and the disabled, and the seniors, the us's, without hope, the us's give up. I know that you cannot live on hope alone, but without it, life is not worth living. And you've got to give them hope. Thank you very much."
However, as with most radical activists, Milk received daily death threats from homophobes. Only a year after Milk entered office, he was assassinated by Dan White. White was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to less than 8 years in prison. The lenient sentence outraged LGBT supporters, and in response, over 5,000 protesters ransacked San Francisco City Hall. 10 years after the Stonewall Riots in 1979, 75,000 people participated in the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. In 1993, the Department of Defense prohibited the U.S. military from refusing applicants based on their sexual orientation. This policy is known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, DADT, because applicants were no longer asked or required to reveal whether they were homosexual. LGBT people were, in fact, required not to reveal their sexual orientation. DADT was designed to stop openly gay individuals from joining the U.S. military. Since the policy was infringing on people's rights, it was eventually repealed in 2011. That same year, President Clinton struck down on gay rights by signing the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, into law. DOMA defined marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman, and thereby deprived legally married same-sex couples of equal treatment. Same-sex couples were denied the 1,138 protections and responsibilities that come with legal marriage, including Social Security, immigration rights, and taxation benefits. DOMA was detrimental to the LGBT people who wanted a legal union. The LGBT community experienced many setbacks and successes in their struggle for equality. In the landmark Supreme Court decision in Lawrence v. Texas in 2003, the LGBT community won the right to privacy when sodomy laws were ruled unconstitutional. Furthermore, in the Matthew Shepard Act of 2009, gender or sexually motivated hate crimes were outlawed to protect the safety of LGBT people. Today, the LGBT community has more rights than ever before. 19 states have legalized same-sex marriage, with Massachusetts being the first to legalize. The LGBT community is still fighting, but thanks to the Stonewall Riots, the movement picked up momentum and LGBT people began working for a change and a brighter future. Stonewall spurred political and cultural change as men and women came together for one common purpose: equality.